What if we told you that nearly 1,000 years ago, in a world we can barely imagine, the very air women breathed was heavy with invisible chains? What if their dreams, their talents, their wildest ambitions were not just discouraged, but often utterly impossible because of the way society was built? Step back to 970 at a time of castles and kingdoms, of widespread illiteracy and powerful belief systems, a time when the world was utterly different, especially for women. Number 12. The unseen walls of legal dependence. Imagine living in a world where your very identity, your rights, and your ability to make fundamental choices about your own life were not truly your own. This was the stark reality for women in 970, at a time when legal systems across what we now call Europe largely viewed women as perpetual dependents. It was as if they were always under the legal guardianship of a man, from the cradle to the grave. Before marriage, a woman was typically under the authority of her father or her nearest male kin. He was her protector, her spokesperson, and the one who held the reins of her legal existence. He would arrange her marriage, negotiate her dowry, and make decisions that would shape her entire future, often without her direct input or even her knowing consent. Her worth, in many legal and social senses, was tied to her family name and her ability to be a pawn in the intricate game of alliances and property exchange between powerful families. Once married, this legal dependence simply shifted from her father to her husband. The concept was often referred to as coverture, a term that would later be formalized, but whose principles were already deeply embedded in the customary laws of the era. Under coverture, the married woman's legal identity was effectively covered or subsumed by that of her husband. She could not, in most cases, own property independently. Any land, goods, or even money she brought into the marriage as a dowry or later acquired legally became her husband's. He had the right to manage it, sell it, or do with it as he pleased. If she somehow inherited land, her husband usually gained control of it for the duration of their marriage. This meant that a woman, no matter how wealthy her family might have been, could find herself without any direct control over her own assets once she said her vows. Her ambition to manage a large estate, to invest in a business, or even to control her own spending was largely stifled by this fundamental legal arrangement. Furthermore, a woman could rarely, if ever, initiate legal proceedings on her own behalf. If she had a grievance, if someone owed her money, or if she was wronged in some way, she needed a male relative, her husband, father, brother, or even a son if she was widowed, to represent her in court. Her voice in the legal arena was often literally absent. Imagine being unable to speak for yourself in matters of justice, relying entirely on someone else to articulate your case, someone who might not share your exact perspective or priority. This fundamental lack of legal standing meant that women's ability to assert their rights, protect their interests, or pursue any form of independent ambition that might involve legal recognition was severely hampered. They were not seen as full legal persons in the same way men were. This reality meant that even if a woman possessed a sharp mind, a keen sense of justice, or a desire to engage with the world beyond her domestic sphere, the very framework of the law stood as an impenetrable barrier. Her ambitions, whatever they might have been, were often confined to the invisible walls built by the prevailing legal customs of 970 at ensuring that she remained a silent, dependent figure in the grand tapestry of medieval society. Number 11. The narrow path of knowledge. Picture a world where books are rare and precious, where the written word is a mystery to most, and where learning is not a universal right but a privilege often reserved for a select few. In 970, this was the reality, and for women, the path to knowledge was particularly narrow, often little more than a dim, winding track. Prevailing societal view was that a woman's primary role was within the home, as a wife, a mother, and a manager of domestic affairs. For these roles, formal education was largely considered unnecessary, even detrimental. Why would a woman need to read dusty Latin texts or debate philosophy when her days were consumed by spinning wool, baking bread, tending to children, and managing a household? Boys, particularly those from noble or clerical families, were the ones destined for education. They learned Latin, the language of scholarship and the church, enabling them to read religious texts, legal documents, and classical works. They might study rhetoric, logic, and arithmetic, skills vital for governance, trade, or religious service. For girls, however, the curriculum was entirely different, if it existed at all in a formal sense. Their education was primarily practical, centered on the skills necessary to run a household effectively. They learned how to cook, clean, spin, weave, preserve food, and manage servants if they were from a wealthier family. They were taught piety and obedience, often through oral storytelling and observation, rather than through reading the Bible themselves. Their religious instruction focused on moral behavior and devotion, preparing them for their expected roles as virtuous wives and mothers, not as scholars or theologians. Literacy. The ability to read and write was a rare commodity for women in 970 AD. While a very small number of aristocratic women might have learned to read often in French or their native vernacular, the vast majority, even among the nobility, were illiterate. Knowledge of Latin, the key to accessing most written material of the era, was almost unheard of among women outside of specialized religious contexts. This meant that women were cut off from the vast majority of recorded knowledge, from legal codes to philosophical treatises, from histories to medical texts. Their understanding of the world was limited to what they heard, observed, or were explicitly taught by male figures. Imagine the sheer frustration of a brilliant mind trapped within this constraint. Unable to explore the world through written words, unable to record her own thoughts, or even to understand the legal documents that dictated her life. There were, however, rare exceptions often within the cloistered walls of convents and monasteries. For some noble women, entering a convent was not just a spiritual calling, but also a potential avenue for intellectual development, perhaps the only one available. Abbesses, the female heads of monasteries, often managed vast estates, overseeing scribes, libraries, and schools within their communities. These women might gain a level of literacy, learn Latin, and engage with sacred texts and even some secular works. They could hold positions of authority, manage complex financial affairs, and even wield significant spiritual influence. However, this was a path open to only a tiny fraction of women, typically those from powerful aristocratic families who could afford the dowry required to enter a religious order. For the overwhelming majority of women in 970, the world of books and formal learning remained a distant, inaccessible realm, meaning their ambitions were confined to the practical, the domestic, and the unspoken, forever limited by the narrow path of knowledge laid out for them. Number 10. The unchosen path of matrimony. Imagine a life where your destiny is sealed not by your own desires or talents, but by the strategic calculations of your family, often before you are even old enough to fully grasp what is happening. For women in 970, marriage was not just a social expectation. It was almost universally the primary, often the sole economic and social role available to them. It was a societal imperative, a fundamental pillar of the medieval world, and a path from which there was little deviation. The concept of romantic love as the basis for marriage, so prevalent in stories and films today, was largely an alien notion. Instead, marriages were meticulously arranged alliances, carefully negotiated between families. These were not matters of the heart, but rather of land power, wealth, and strategic advantage. A daughter was a valuable commodity in this complex web of relationships, a means to solidify family influence, expand landholdings, or forge peace between rival houses. From the moment a girl was born into a noble family, her future marriage was a topic of hushed conversation and calculation. Her value was often tied to her dowry, the property or wealth her family provided to her husband upon marriage. This dowry, whether in land, money, or goods, would often remain in the husband's control, yet it was a critical component of her desirability as a bride. A larger, more attractive dowry could secure a more advantageous match, elevating her family's status or gaining them a powerful ally. For the woman herself, however, her personal ambitions or aspirations for a different kind of life were rarely, if ever, taken into account. She was expected to be obedient, to accept the husband chosen for her, and to fulfill her duties within the marriage regardless of her personal feelings. Her voice in the matter was often unheard, or at best, quietly dismissed. Once married, a woman's value and purpose were primarily defined by her capacity to bear children, especially male heirs. Sons were crucial for the continuation of the family line, the inheritance of property, and the perpetuation of the family's name and power. A woman who bore many sons was highly esteemed, solidifying her position within her husband's family. Conversely, a woman who struggled to conceive or who produced only daughters might face anxiety, social pressure, or even the threat of repudiation, though this was less common in 970 AD compared to earlier periods, as the Church solidified marriage as indissoluble. Constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth became a defining feature of her existence, often limiting her physical energy and time for other pursuits. Her identity became inextricably linked to her role as a wife and mother, with her ambition for personal achievement or public recognition often overshadowed by the demands of reproduction and domestic life. For women who did not marry, perhaps due to lack of dowry, insufficient connections, or a personal choice, rare as it was, the options were extremely limited. Spinsterhood was often viewed with pity or suspicion, a sign of failure in a society where marriage was the default. The most respectable alternative was to enter a convent, dedicating her life to God. This offered a different kind of purpose, often involving prayer, study, and communal life, and as we explored before, it could provide opportunities for learning and management that were unavailable elsewhere. However, this path was accessible only to a select few, often requiring a dowry of its own to be accepted into an order. For the vast majority, the single unchosen path of matrimony lay ahead a predetermined journey that largely dictated their ambitions, their roles, and their very purpose in the world of 970 AD, leaving little room for individual dreams to flourish beyond the confines of hearth and home. Number 9. The confines of the domestic sphere. Imagine a world where your daily existence is largely confined to a specific place, a realm defined by hearth smoke and the rhythmic sounds of household labor, with the bustling outside world often a distant echo. For women in 970, and this was the reality of the domestic sphere, the home serving as both their sanctuary and their unspoken prison. Society largely dictated that a woman's place, regardless of her social standing, was within the walls of her residence, whether it was a humble cottage, a manor house, or a grand castle. Her primary duties revolved around the management and maintenance of this space, along with the care of its inhabitants. This meant an endless cycle of tasks: preparing food, often from scratch, grinding grain, baking bread, cooking stews over an open fire, spinning wool into thread, weaving that thread into cloth, and then sewing garments for the family, cleaning, mending, and maintaining the household's possessions. For noble women, these tasks were overseen rather than performed directly, but the ultimate responsibility for the running of the household, including managing servants and inventories, still rested firmly on their shoulders. Childcare was, of course, a central and demanding aspect of a woman's life. With large families being common and infant mortality rates tragically high, women were often pregnant or nursing for much of their fertile years. Constant demands of caring for infants and young children, educating them in basic skills and religious piety, and nursing them through frequent illnesses consumed an enormous amount of their time and energy. This relentless cycle of domestic labor and childcare left little room, if any, for pursuits beyond the home. Her ambitions, therefore, had to fit within these narrow confines. Perhaps she dreamt of becoming a master weaver, producing intricate tapestries, but her efforts were often seen as mere household production rather than a commercial venture. Perhaps she longed to explore new territories, but her travels were typically limited to necessary journeys to the nearest market town or the occasional visit to relatives, always under the protection and guidance of a male relative. Public life, the sphere of politics, warfare, trade, and formal religious observance was overwhelmingly a male domain. Men left the home to work in the fields, to engage in trade, to attend local assemblies, or to go to war. They participated in the wider world, shaping its laws and events. Women, by contrast, rarely ventured into these public arenas. Their influence, if any, was almost exclusively informal, exerted within the family unit or through their husbands. A queen or a noblewoman might hold sway over her husband or sons, offering advice or pushing for certain policies, but this power was always indirect, never formally recognized, and almost never exercised in public forums. She could not speak in the local court, participate in a town council, or lead troops into battle. The physical confinement of the domestic sphere was not just a matter of social expectation, but also often a practical reality. Security and safety were constant concerns in a fragmented and often violent world. Women, particularly those of higher status, were often protected within fortified homes, not just from outside threats, but also from social impropriety. Unchaperoned travel or public appearance was generally frowned upon and could even endanger a woman's reputation. This practical and societal limitation meant that even if a woman harbored grand ambitions to become a renowned trader, a scholar, or a political leader, the very structure of her daily life and the pervasive social norms created an almost impenetrable barrier. Her world was for the most part the world within her walls. Her ambitions confined to the rhythm of her daily chores and the quiet hopes for her family's well-being, largely unseen and unheard by the broader world of 970. Number 8. The weight of heavenly judgment. Imagine a pervasive belief system that permeated every aspect of life, from the grandest cathedrals to the humblest cottages, shaping not just how people prayed, but how they understood themselves and each other. In 970, Christianity, specifically the Latin Church, was the dominant spiritual and cultural force across much of Europe, and its doctrines, as interpreted by its male leaders, cast a long shadow over women's ambitions. Prevailing theological views often painted women in a complex and sometimes contradictory light, but generally emphasized their subservience, linking them intrinsically to the original sin and portraying them as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation. The story of Eve, who succumbed to the serpent's temptation in the Garden of Eden, was frequently invoked as the quintessential example of female frailty and the source of humanity's fall from grace. This narrative was used to justify male authority, suggesting that women, due to their inherent weakness, required constant guidance and control from men to avoid sin. Church fathers and theologians, almost exclusively male, articulated these views in sermons, theological treatises, and biblical commentaries that were disseminated throughout society. They taught that women were by nature less rational and more emotional than men, making them more easily led astray. This perception directly influenced the roles deemed appropriate for women. They were encouraged to be humble, obedient, and silent, particularly in public and within religious contexts. The Apostle Paul's instruction that women should learn in quietness and full submission and not have authority over a man were powerful and often cited justifications for their exclusion from positions of power, influence, and even public speech within the church, and by extension within broader society. This meant that any ambition a woman might have had to teach, preach, or lead within a religious setting was fundamentally stifled by doctrinal prohibitions. Even if she possessed profound spiritual insight or theological understanding, her voice was not to be heard in the pulpit or in scholarly debate. While the Virgin Mary presented an ideal of purity, humility, and motherhood, she was also presented as a unique figure, a paradox of sinlessness in an otherwise fallen female line. Her unattainable perfection served more as a distant standard than an achievable model for ordinary women, whose lives were still defined by the taint of Eve. The path of the nun, as previously mentioned, was often presented as the most pious alternative to marriage, allowing a woman to dedicate her life to God and escape the worldly temptations of marriage and childbearing. However, even within the convent, women were typically subordinate to male clerical authority, and while abbesses could wield significant administrative power within their own orders, their spiritual authority was often limited by male bishops and popes. They could manage large estates, but they could not administer sacraments or preach to mixed congregations. Pervasive influence of religious doctrine seeped into every corner of medieval life, reinforcing societal norms that placed women in a subordinate position. It colored how men viewed women, how women viewed themselves, and how both sexes understood their roles in the cosmic order. This meant that a woman's ambition to be a leader, an intellectual, or even just an independent agent, often collided with the deeply ingrained belief that such aspirations were not only unwomanly, but potentially against God's divine plan. The weight of heavenly judgment, as interpreted by the powerful Church, created an invisible ceiling on female ambition, ensuring that their spiritual, intellectual, and social aspirations were almost always constrained by the dominant religious narratives of 970 AD. Number 7. The unforgiving grip of economic beggary. Imagine a life where your labor is constant, your hands are never idle, yet the fruits of your efforts, the very income you help generate, are not truly your own. This was the unrelenting reality for most women in 970 AD, caught in the unforgiving grip of economic dependency on male family members. In an agrarian society where wealth was primarily measured in land and its produce, women rarely, if ever, held independent economic power or control over significant assets. From the moment of birth, a woman's economic fate was tied to her father's household. If she worked the land, tended livestock, or produced goods like textiles, the output of her labor contributed to the family's overall well-being, but the decision-making power over those resources, and any surplus they generated, lay firmly with the male head of the household. Once married, this dependency simply transitioned to her husband. As discussed, her dowry, while valuable, typically became part of her husband's property to manage. Even as she engaged in economically productive activities, such as brewing ale for sale, spinning and weaving cloth for market, or selling eggs and cheese from the family farm, any money earned was generally considered to be her husband's. She could not typically open her own bank account, if such a thing even existed in the modern sense, nor could she enter into contracts or manage large-scale financial transactions independently. Her access to money was often limited to small allowances for household expenses, or what her husband deemed appropriate. This meant that a woman's ambition to build wealth, to become a successful merchant, or to invest in a lucrative venture was fundamentally stifled by her inability to control capital or to operate independently in the nascent economic systems of the time. Her economic contributions were essential to the household's survival, but her economic autonomy was virtually non-existent. For women who were widowed, there was a slight, often temporary shift in their economic standing. A widow might, for a period, regain control over her dowry, or be granted a dower portion of her deceased husband's land, typically 1/3 of his property, for her lifetime, known as dower. This allowed some widows a degree of economic independence and the ability to manage property, raise their children, and sometimes even engage in trade or business. There are historical examples of widowed women successfully managing estates or urban businesses, demonstrating a potential for ambition when direct male control was removed. However, this independence was often precarious. Widows were still largely expected to remarry, or their property might revert to her deceased husband's male relatives upon her death. Furthermore, this was an independence granted by specific circumstances, not an inherent right available to all women. It was also an independence, often born of necessity rather than choice, as she now bore the full burden of providing for herself and her children. For the overwhelming majority of women in 970, had economic ambitions beyond contributing to the family's immediate sustenance were largely unattainable. They were part of a collective economic unit, but lacked individual agency. Their labor was vital, their contributions indispensable, but the power to direct those resources to accumulate personal wealth or to pursue independent economic ventures remained firmly out of their hands. This constant, unyielding economic dependency meant that even the most ambitious and enterprising woman found her dreams tethered to the will and resources of the men around her, leaving little room for her own financial aspirations to truly flourish in the world of 970 AD. Number 6. The unyielding grip of inherited power. Imagine a world where the very foundation of wealth and status, the land itself, was overwhelmingly passed down through one gender, effectively sidelining the other. In 970, across much of Europe, patrilineal inheritance systems held an unyielding grip on society. This meant that land titles and political power, the most valuable assets in a largely agrarian and feudal world, typically passed from father to son. This system was not just a legal custom, it was a deeply ingrained cultural norm that reinforced male dominance and significantly constrained women's ambitions and their ability to forge their own paths. A family's continued prosperity and influence were directly tied to the birth of male heirs. If a noble family had sons, their estates and titles were largely secure, passed intact to the eldest male. Daughters, however, were usually excluded from this direct line of inheritance, receiving instead a dowry, as previously discussed, which was a portion of movable goods or sometimes land, but typically remained under the control of her husband. This meant that even women born into the wealthiest and most powerful families were unlikely to inherit significant landholdings or titles in their own right, unless there was a complete absence of male heirs. In such rare cases, a daughter might become an heiress, but her inheritance was often seen as a temporary measure until she married, at which point the land and its associated power would pass to her husband. The marriage of an heiress was a particularly coveted prize for ambitious men, as it offered a shortcut to wealth and status that might otherwise be unattainable. She was, in essence, a conduit for property, not an independent owner or manager. This system of inheritance ensured that control over the most valuable resource, land, remained predominantly in male hands, perpetuating a cycle of male power and influence across generations. A woman's ambition to establish her own dynasty, to build a powerful domain, or to exert direct authority over a territory was largely impossible due to this fundamental structuring of property rights. Consider the ripple effects of this system. If a woman couldn't inherit land, she couldn't effectively become a lord or a lady in her own right, wielding the kind of military or political power that came with land ownership. Her influence remained, as always, indirect, primarily through her husband or sons. Even if she possessed keen administrative skills, strategic acumen, or a profound understanding of governance, the legal framework of inheritance largely prevented her from applying these talents in a public authoritative capacity. Her potential as a powerful landholder or a political figure was simply not recognized or accommodated by the prevailing legal and social norms. The system was designed to concentrate wealth and power in the male line, ensuring stability through predictable succession, but at the cost of women's independent agency and ambition. The few exceptions, such as widowed queens or countesses who might temporarily manage their husband's estates on behalf of a minor son, highlight just how ingrained the patrilineal system was. Even then, their authority was often viewed as a temporary guardianship, a placeholder until a male heir came of age. This unyielding grip of inherited power meant that for women in 970 the avenues to significant wealth, independent status, and direct political authority were largely closed off by a system that prioritized male lineage above all else. Their ambitions, however grand, were often confined to influencing decisions from the sidelines, never truly holding the reins of power that came with direct control over the most valuable asset in their world, the land itself. Number 5. The shadow of physical vulnerability. Imagine living in a world where your personal safety is a constant gnawing concern, where the rule of law is often localized and weak, and where your physical well-being relies heavily on the protection of others. In 970, women lived under the ever-present shadow of physical vulnerability, a reality that profoundly stifled their ambitions and limited their freedom of movement and action. The medieval world was, by modern standards, a dangerous place. Centralized authority was often fragmented, and justice was frequently dispensed locally, sometimes through might rather than right. For women, this meant that they were often more susceptible to violence, including abduction, sexual assault, and domestic abuse, with limited formal recourse or protection. Concept of state provided security and legal frameworks designed to protect individual rights as we understand them today simply did not exist. A woman's physical safety was largely dependent on the men in her life, her father, brothers, and especially her husband. They were her protectors, her champions in a world that could be brutal and unforgiving. This reliance on male protection was not just a social norm, but a practical necessity. Traveling alone, particularly outside of settled areas or familiar communities, was extremely perilous for women. The risk of encountering bandits, robed knights, or even being abducted for forced marriage or ransom was very real. This threat effectively confined many women to their homes, villages, or the immediate vicinity of their family's land. Any ambition that required independent travel, such as becoming a merchant, a pilgrim, or a scholar seeking distant libraries, was largely curtailed by this omnipresent danger. The very idea of an unchaperoned woman embarking on a journey was often seen as reckless, improper, and dangerous. Within the home, women were also vulnerable. While medieval records are sparse on the prevalence of domestic violence, it was certainly a reality, and legal avenues for redress were few. A wife was legally subject to her husband's authority, and physical chastisement, though not unlimited, was often considered within his rights to maintain order in the household. There was little concept of marital rape or domestic abuse as criminal offenses. A woman seeking to escape an abusive situation would find few, if any, places to go, and little legal support. Her family might intervene, but more often than not, the expectation was endurance and obedience. This lack of legal and social protection against domestic violence meant that a woman's physical well-being was often at the mercy of her husband's temperament, and her options for recourse were severely limited. The fear of physical harm and the societal norms built around protecting women by confining them thus acted as a powerful constraint on their ambitions. They were expected to be modest, to remain within designated safe spaces, and to avoid situations that might compromise their reputation or put them at risk. This meant that opportunities for public engagement, for independent economic activity, or for intellectual pursuits that required venturing beyond safe boundaries were largely denied to them. The shadow of physical vulnerability, both external and internal, fundamentally shaped women's lives in 970 AD, forcing their ambitions to remain within the safety of their homes, often unspoken and unrealized, under the ever-present threat of a dangerous and often unforgiving world. Number 4. The silent halls of power. Imagine a world where the weighty decisions that shape society, the laws that govern daily life, and the very direction of kingdoms were debated and determined in halls where women's voices were conspicuously absent. In 970, across Europe, women were systematically excluded from formal political voice and representation. This meant that their perspectives, their needs, and their potential contributions to governance, justice, and public policy were largely unheard in the silent halls of power, fundamentally stifling any ambition they might have had to lead, to legislate, or to shape the public realm. The concept of voting rights, as we understand them today, did not exist, even for most men, as governance was largely feudal and hierarchical. However, men participated in various forms of political discourse and decision-making, from local village councils to noble assemblies and royal courts. These were exclusively male domains. Whether it was a local village court deciding disputes over land, a lord's council advising on military campaigns, or a king's court making decisions that affected vast territories, women were not present as participants. They could not serve as judges, jurors, advisors, or representatives. Their lack of legal standing, as explored earlier, meant they could not advocate for themselves or others in these formal settings. Even high-ranking noblewomen, wives of powerful lords or queens, rarely held formal political authority in their own right. Their influence, if any, was invariably informal and indirect, exerted through their relationships with their husbands, sons, or other male relatives. A queen might advise her king in private chambers, or a mother might guide her son's policies, but their power was always mediated, never direct, and almost never exercised in public forums where laws were debated or treaties signed. This exclusion was rooted in a combination of legal custom, religious doctrine, and societal expectation. Women were generally seen as unfit for public life, lacking the necessary rationality, temperament, or physical prowess for governance and warfare. Their designated role was in the domestic sphere, leaving the public realm to men. This meant that even a woman with extraordinary political acumen, a keen understanding of justice, or a strong desire to serve her community in a leadership capacity would find virtually every door to formal power closed to her. Her ambitions to shape society through legislation, to resolve conflicts through diplomacy, or to lead a community were simply not accommodated by the political structures of 970 AD. She could not hold public office, lead an army, or sit on a royal council. The rare exceptions to this rule were often born of necessity rather than design. A queen regent, for example, might temporarily govern a kingdom on behalf of her minor son, as was the case with Empress Theophanu, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire after the death of her husband Otto I. However, even these instances of female leadership were often contested, temporary, and viewed as deviations from the norm, awaiting the moment a male heir could assume full authority. Her power was a borrowed one, not inherent. For the vast majority of women, the halls of power remained silent and inaccessible, a barrier that ensured their ambitions for political leadership or public service remained firmly within the realm of unfulfilled dreams, leaving the governance of their world entirely in the hands of men. Number 3. The restricted palette of professions. Imagine a world where your skills and talents, no matter how keen, were largely channeled into a very narrow set of roles, most of which revolved around the home or its immediate extensions. In 970, women faced a highly restricted palette of occupational opportunities outside the domestic sphere, fundamentally stifling their ambitions for diverse careers or independent professional lives. While it is crucial to understand that all members of medieval society, men and women alike, worked incredibly hard, the nature of that work and its potential for status or advancement was vastly different for women. The vast majority of women were engaged in agricultural labor alongside men, working in the fields, tending to animals, and assisting with harvests. This was essential for survival, but it was largely seen as a familial contribution rather than an independent profession. Beyond the fields, women's work often mirrored and extended their domestic responsibilities. They were the primary producers of textiles, spinning wool into thread and weaving it into cloth, a laborious process that provided clothing for the family and sometimes a small surplus for sale. They brewed ale, a staple beverage, for their households and often for local taverns. They engaged in food preparation and preservation, making cheese, butter, and drying meat and fish. Some women might have worked as midwives, healers, using herbal remedies, or wet nurses for noble families. In urban centers, a limited number of women might assist their husbands in trades like baking or shoemaking, or run small market stalls selling produce or simple goods. These roles, while vital, were generally considered extensions of their domestic duties, were often low in status, and offered little in the way of independent wealth or social mobility. The highly regarded, prestigious, and often lucrative professions were almost entirely closed to women. Clergy, the legal profession, medicine, beyond folk healing, scholarship, and the military were exclusively male domains. A woman could not be a priest, a bishop, or a university scholar. She could not be a knight, a soldier, or a professional scribe in a secular court. The educational requirements for these professions, which often involved Latin literacy, advanced theological or legal training, and formal apprenticeships were largely unavailable to women. Furthermore, the societal norms and expectations surrounding female modesty, physical strength, and perceived intellectual capacity further cemented these exclusions. Any ambition a woman might have had to pursue a scholarly career, to command a military unit, to practice law, or to enter the hallowed halls of learning was simply not possible. Even within the limited trades open to women, their autonomy was often constrained. A female brewer or baker typically worked within the framework of her husband's household, or a male-led guild, rather than as an independent entrepreneur. There were rare exceptions, such as female guild members in later centuries, but in 970, that opportunities for women to operate independently in any significant commercial capacity were severely limited. This restricted palette of professions meant that women's immense talents and capabilities were largely confined to roles that were essential for the household and community, but offered little opportunity for personal advancement. Specialized opportunity for Preda. Their ambitions to forge their own professional destinies were thus profoundly stifled by the very structure of the medieval labor market. Number 2. The unforgiving judge of reputation. Imagine living in a society where your worth, your social standing, and your very future could be shattered by a whisper, a rumor, or a perceived deviation from an unwritten code of conduct. For women in 970, the unforgiving judge of reputation, particularly regarding chastity and obedience, was a powerful societal constraint that stifled their ambitions and shaped their every move. A woman's honor, and by extension the honor of her entire family, was inextricably linked to her sexual purity before marriage and her fidelity within it. This expectation was paramount, a cornerstone of medieval social order, and any perceived transgression could lead to devastating consequences. For unmarried women, the loss of virginity before marriage was a catastrophic blow. It could render her unmarriageable, bringing immense shame upon her family and potentially condemning her to a life of destitution or social ostracism. Her value as a marriageable commodity plummeted, and with it, her entire future. This intense focus on chastity meant that women's interactions with men were heavily monitored and regulated. Unchaperoned encounters, public displays of affection, or even too much perceived independence could invite suspicion and lead to rumors that would be incredibly difficult to shake off. This acted as a powerful brake on any ambition a woman might have had to move freely, to interact broadly in society, or to pursue intellectual or economic ventures that might involve unchaperoned interactions with men. Her very movement and social engagement were often dictated by the need to protect her and her family's reputation. A woman's reputation was not just a personal matter. It was a communal asset, and its perceived damage could have far-reaching consequences for her entire lineage. Once married, the expectation shifted to absolute fidelity. Adultery on the part of a wife was considered a grave offense, not just against her husband, but against the social order itself. It could lead to severe punishment, repudiation, or even violence, and it fundamentally undermined the legitimacy of heirs, which was crucial in a patrilineal society. Obedience to her husband was also a core expectation. A good wife was one who was humble, compliant, and managed her household efficiently under her husband's direction. Deviating from these norms, being perceived as disobedient, argumentative, or overly ambitious outside her domestic role, could bring social disapproval and damage her reputation within the community. Her ambition to assert her own will, to challenge male authority, or to pursue individual goals that might be seen as conflicting with her wifely duties, was often silenced by the pervasive fear of social censure. Pressure to conform to these rigid expectations meant that women's lives were often lived under a microscope of social scrutiny. Every action, every word, every association was potentially judged against this stringent code of honor and shame. This constant judgment, this fear of tarnishing a reputation, acted as an invisible but incredibly powerful constraint on women's ambitions. It encouraged conformity, discouraged risk-taking, and stifled any impulse towards independence or self-assertion that might be seen as stepping outside the narrowly defined boundaries of acceptable female behavior. In the world of 970, a woman's reputation was not just a part of her identity. It was often the very foundation upon which her entire life and the lives of her family rested, and its unforgiving judgment ensured that many women's dreams remained unspoken and unrealized. Number 1. The relentless cycle of childbearing. Imagine a life where your body itself dictates the rhythm of your existence, where the demands of reproduction consume a significant portion of your physical energy and time, leaving little room for other pursuits. For women in 970, add the relentless cycle of childbearing and the harsh realities of high mortality rates were perhaps the most profound and pervasive constraints on their ambitions. In an era without reliable contraception, frequent pregnancies were the norm and indeed the expectation. Women were often pregnant or nursing for much of their fertile years, beginning shortly after marriage, which typically occurred in their mid to late teens. The societal imperative to produce heirs, particularly sons, meant that families desired many children, and women were expected to fulfill this crucial role. Childbirth itself was an incredibly dangerous and often life-threatening event. Maternal mortality rates were tragically high, with countless women dying during labor or from complications shortly thereafter. The medical knowledge and practices of the time were rudimentary, offering little in the way of intervention or pain relief. Every pregnancy carried with it a very real risk of death, not just for the infant, but for the mother as well. This constant danger must have loomed large over every woman's life, shaping her decisions and perhaps tempering her dreams. Beyond the immediate danger of childbirth, the physical demands of frequent pregnancies, nursing infants, and caring for multiple young children were immense. A woman's body was constantly under strain, leaving her physically exhausted and often with little energy for intellectual pursuits, artistic endeavors, or ambitious projects outside the home. Furthermore, infant and child mortality rates were shockingly high. It was not uncommon for a woman to bear many children, only to see several of them die in infancy or early childhood from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. This meant that the cycle of pregnancy and childbirth often continued unabated, as families sought to ensure the survival of at least a few offspring into adulthood. The emotional toll of constantly grieving lost children, combined with the physical demands of repeated pregnancies, added another layer of burden to women's lives. This relentless biological reality meant that a woman's primary occupation, and often her defining purpose, was that of a mother and reproducer. Her daily life was structured around the needs of her children and the demands of her reproductive cycle. This biological imperative often overshadowed any other ambition a woman might have possessed. How could she devote herself to scholarship if she was constantly recovering from childbirth or nursing an infant? How could she pursue a trade if she was always responsible for a growing brood of children? The demands of motherhood in 970-odd were all-encompassing, leaving little time, energy, or opportunity for women to pursue personal aspirations that extended beyond the immediate needs of their family and household. While motherhood was undoubtedly a source of profound joy and purpose for many women, it also fundamentally limited the scope of their ambitions, ensuring that for the vast majority their lives were defined by the rhythm of reproduction and the relentless cycle of childbearing, a powerful, inescapable constraint in the world of 970-odd.